All right. Good evening or good morning to everyone. We are going to be examining some more critiques of the theory of the Solomon Spaulding Sidney Rigdon theory. But let me just make it absolutely in telling you once again that we find contradictions between the Bible and the Book of Mormon. We have surveyed in my series how there are there's a lot of problems with the Book of Mormon. And so the internal evidence to me is very sufficient. With regards to where it actually came from, it's another question. And like I said, this is a theory. I think it's a strong theory, but I also like to look at those who try to say, well, it can't be this, and give responses. And the responses that I give, this is all done with love. I really love these people. I care for them, care for their souls. I want them to come to the knowledge of the truth. Now, what I'm going to do actually, I'm crazy enough to do this, but I haven't watched this video yet, and so we're going to listen, and I'm going to stop if I have to, and then we'll examine what they said, and then we'll keep going. So, evidently, what this is from, I'll put the link to the video in the description at the end when I get it edited. So let's watch it.
Welcome to our series about the witnesses of the Book of Mormon. My name is Camry Bagley Fox, and we are joined today by Dr. Garrett Dirkmaat.
Hi.
Thanks for being here.
I'm glad to be here.
So, people have a lot of different ideas about where the Book of Mormon could have come from. One of the popular ones seems to be Solomon Spaulding and his manuscript. Can you tell us about that?
One thing that becomes pretty
Solomon Spaulding and his manuscript. So, once again, I want to relate to you that there are we know at least two manuscripts, or even there's more that he wrote according to the witnesses in Conduit, Ohio. So, just to let you all know of that.
pretty apparent studying Joseph Smith's documents and studying Joseph Smith's writing, especially from this early time period, from 1828 and 1829, is that the Book of Mormon is so far beyond his capabilities that if you're someone looking for a way to describe where the text came from, it causes a problem because oh yeah, Joseph Smith just wrote it. Well, have you read literally anything else he wrote? Because he clearly didn't.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah, and I would agree that Joseph Smith is not the candidate for the Book of Mormon. We agree with that. It had to be people who were with a lot of education, in which Solomon Spaulding does fit that as a candidate, but also Sidney Rigdon as well. And so, just to put that out there.
actually funny because critics of the Book of Mormon and Latter-day Saints actually kind of agree on this point in the sense that this text is coming from somewhere else. Joseph was saying, yeah, the text came from God as a miraculous translation. So it wasn't Joseph writing it. But of course, critics of the church then and now, they don't want to take that explanation of the origin of the text. And so they've tried various attempts to try to say, what
It's not that I don't want to. It's just that is the case when you examine it, um, that you see that there are contradictions between it and the book of and the Bible and the Book of Mormon, in which, for example, like I say in my first video, the age of miracles, for example. I mean, it's clearly that the Bible teaches in 1 Corinthians 13 and Ephesians 4 that the age of miracles would pass away during the first century AD, while is the case in the Book of Mormon, like in Mormon and Moroni and other books, that it claims that miracles would be continuous. So that's a point to think about. And there's other things. There's contradictions. One of the videos I did just recently, I showed that in the Book of Mormon it says our first parents were beguiled, Adam and Eve. Okay? But if you take 1 Timothy 2, Adam was not beguiled, but Eve was. Eve was beguiled. So you see, that's a contradiction between the Bible and the Book of Mormon.
this is where it's really coming from. And this story has its origin with a man by the name of Dr. Philastus Hurlbut, which is probably like
Now, if you study very carefully what I talk about in our parts, you will see that it's really interesting how. Well, let me take you real quick. Um, Okay. Let me. So, remember how I talked about how Orson Hyde and I think Samuel Smith is his name came to Conneaut, Ohio, where Solomon Spaulding once lived, which was February of 1832. Okay, that's very important. It's 2 years after the Book of Mormon was published. And it was a man by Nehemiah King who told, what's his name? Aaron Wright and possible others like Nahum Howard, told that this was Solomon Spaulding's writings being read by when Orson Hyde was preaching from the Book of Mormon. So that's very important that connection's made. And then you had the connection with the Cleveland Advertiser in February 15th, 1831 that actually said that Rigdon was the one who was the author of the Book of Mormon, which I find really interesting. So that's a year earlier. And then Bennett, he also made that same discovery that it was Rigdon who was the author of the Book of Mormon. And that's in August and September of 1831. And then what's interesting is Hulbert, let me just put it this way. Let me just go a little bit further. So you'll remember that basically Hulbert somehow got a hold of this information about Solomon Spaulding somehow. He had heard, possible through Jackson. That's what a man by the name of Benjamin Winchester said. But here's the thing. So he goes to see John and Martha Spaulding, the brother of Solomon Spaulding, gets their affidavits, goes to see the Conneaut witnesses, which are Aaron Wright and Nahum Howard and those. And then there was a committee in Mentor, Ohio that supported Hulbert to go to see the widow of Spaulding. He obtains manuscript story. But what's really interesting to me is, so Hulbert is evidently told there by the widow about Rigdon. And you see, these are independent connections, which I find very interesting. And so he gives that information to Pomeroy Tucker, believed to be the notorious Rigdon, that yes, the original manuscript was manuscript found, but it was transformed and it was done by the notorious Rigdon. And so those are the connections that we see somewhere around December of 1833, or in December of 1833. So just to let people know about that. All right, going back. Let's keep. Well, there.
Like the greatest name of all time. But before you ask me which university, Dr. Philastus Hurlbut, which is probably like the greatest name of all time. But before you ask me which university he got his PhD at, or if he's a medical doctor, actually his parents just named him doctor.
Really?
So his first name's Doctor. Yeah. So his first name's Doctor. In fact, his friend said that he was full of gab and quite illiterate. So Dr. Hurlbut was an early elder in the church from Ohio, and he gets sent on a mission to Western Pennsylvania. And he commits adultery apparently several times while he's there. And, then as now, when you commit adultery on your mission, it's not a good way to stay on a mission or in the church. And Hurlbut is cut off from the church for this adultery, but begs to be let back in. He appeals his case, and the judgment that Joseph renders is that you needed to be cut off for what you did. But kind of showing the merciful side of Joseph, he so desperately wants to be back in, and so they allow him back in. Well, almost immediately thereafter, he begins bragging to people that, I tricked Joseph. I wasn't really repentant. And then apparently, again, according to one source, attempts to commit yet another adultery. So he's cut off again from the church. Well, this time, Hurlbut does not go quietly into the night. He's going to tell people the real truth of Mormonism, right? I know Joseph. I was an elder in the church, and let me tell you. And one of the arguments that Hurlbut is going to make is that while he was on his mission in Western Pennsylvania, he came across the actual origin of the Book of Mormon, and that there was a former preacher living in Western Pennsylvania by the name of Solomon Spaulding. Now, Solomon Spaulding had died in 1816. So whenever you're trying to come up with who did it, it's always best to blame it on someone who's dead.
Right.
You can't interview them at all. And Hurlbut.
So, the sources there it's very tough to unravel, to be honest. I mean, I'm not discounting that it might have been the case that Hurlbut did commit adultery. That's very highly possible. But I mean, with regards to how he discovered or found out this idea of Solomon Spaulding and manuscript, it's hard, and I would encourage everyone to read Benjamin Winchester's book. But the thing is, with regards to that Jackson there, he knew about the first manuscript. Now, it's interesting to me that Hurlbut got some money raised by the committee to go all the way to New York to find out from the widow of Spaulding. I mean, he actually wanted to find out some information. So I found that very interesting, So he would not have known a lot of this information until he went to see the widow. Anyway.
Hurlbut's going to claim that Spaulding wrote this novel deliberately with the King James biblical style of English, right? That's how he styled it. And it was all about people populating the Americas. He's going to claim that that's the actual source of the Book of Mormon text. Well, for the group in Kirtland who are opposed to the church and calling themselves the Anti-Mormon Committee, this is a godsend to them. Here's someone who used to be a member of the church who knows all their ins and outs, who actually saw where this book came from. And it actually becomes one of the featured arguments in the first anti-Mormon book that's published in 1834 by Eber Howe. It's called Mormonism Unveiled. From 1833, and really from 34, when that book is published, antagonists of the church think that they have the answer to the problem. Because there's two problems with the Book of Mormon. One, that it exists at all. Because, again, we have Joseph Smith's writings, and this is far more expansive. But there's also a second problem, that it's convincing people that it's a record of Jesus. Mm-hmm. Anyone can write a book, but we have not just, your average, ordinary butcher, baker, and the candlestick maker that are believing this. You have learned preachers who love the Bible, who are reading it and saying, this is the Word of God. So how do you get not just a book that's written, but a book that apparently incorporates religious aspects to the point that people who should know better, in quotes, right, are believing this is the Word of God? Solomon Spaulding, that theory helps fill both of those needs. Well, obviously he's intelligent. He's this pastor. He's a writer. And because he's a pastor, he's able to weave these biblical religious elements into the text in a way that he never intended to have people think was really from God, but that these Mormons are now able to use to convince people is the real truth. This is the primary dismissal of the Book of Mormon from antagonists of the church for essentially for half a century. Later, antagonists would interview Solomon Spaulding's family. Oh yes, I remember my dad was talking about Lehi and Nephi all the time from when he was writing his book. And so it seemed to give credence to it.
So the theory that this manuscript was used to be the Book of Mormon, is that valid? What sources do we have on that?
I am here to tell you today that your feelings are valid. Your trauma is valid. Your hurt is your...
It's certainly not considered valid by academics looking at the text, because we now have Spaulding's manuscript, and it's...
I figured he probably would go there. So you see, like I said, the very first, there is this manuscript called Manuscript Story that was discovered in 1884 in Hawaii. And so that's what he means for 50 years, because from 1830 to 1880-ish, then it's finally discovered this manuscript, and they think that is the manuscript of Solomon Spaulding. But what's really interesting to me is, and I hope that he might discuss this, but when when he discovered the manuscript story in the trunk, he went back and he already had gotten the affidavits of the Connuet witnesses. And then he goes to New York on his trip, and he comes back, and we actually have this piece of evidence of a letter from who we believe to be Aaron Wright. It's pretty strong that it's Aaron Wright, and Aaron Wright actually says in that draft letter, and we can certainly look at it if you like. Actually, I didn't plan on doing that, but let me see if I can find that real quick, because I think that's pretty important, to be honest. Let me see if I can find that for y'all. Well, because to me, this is one of the strongest pieces of evidence here. And we have, sorry, and I'm just keeping you on suspense with all this silence, right? Well, check one. Oh, here we go. Here it is. So this is that letter. Dear Sir, whereas I have been informed that you have been appointed with others to investigate the subject of Mormonism, and a resolution has been passed to ascertain the real origin of the said book. This is therefore to inform you that I have made a statement to D.P. Hulbert relative to writings of Solomon Spalding, Esquire. Said Hulbert is now at my store. I have examined the writings which he has obtained from said Spalding's widow. And I recognize them. Make sure everybody can read it. I recognize them to be the handwriting of said Spalding, but not the manuscript I had reference to in my statement. Before alluded to, as he informed me, he wrote in the first place, he wrote for his own amusement, and then altered his plan, commenced writing a history of the first settlement of America. The particulars you'll find in my testimony dated September 1833, August 1833. And I think he marked out September, and it was August 1833. For years before he left this place, I was quite intimate with said Solomon Spalding. We had many private interviews. The history he was writing was the topic of his conversation, relating his progress and contemplating the avails of the same. I also contemplated reading his history, but never saw it in print until I saw the Book of Mormon, where I find much of the history and the names verbatim. The Book of Mormon does not contain all the writings of said Spaldings. I expect to see them if Smith is permitted to go on, as he says, get his other plates. The first time that Mr. Hyde, Orson Hyde, a Mormon preacher from Kirtland, preached in the center schoolhouse in this place, the Honorable Nehemiah King attended as soon as Hyde had got through. King left the house and said that Hyde had preached from the writings of Solomon Spalding. In conclusion, I will observe that the names in most of the historical part of the Book of Mormon is as familiar to me as most modern history, if it is not Spalding's writings copied, is the same as he wrote, and if Smith was inspired, I think it was by the same spirit that Spalding possessed, which he confessed to be the love of money. Okay, so you see there. All right. So more than one manuscript. That's one of the main points we want to make.
Nothing similar to the Book of Mormon. So in the mid-1880s.
So nothing, let me just go back a little bit, if that'd be all right.
Considered valid by academics to give credence to.
The human body is actually not a thing, but
To it.
So the theory that this manuscript was used to be the Book of Mormon, is that valid? What sources do we have on that?
It's certainly not considered valid by academics looking at the text because we now have Spalding's manuscript and it's nothing similar to the Book of Mormon. So in the
Well, I mean, I have read Manuscript Story, the first manuscript, and what's interesting to me is if you watch my videos on this, you'll see there's some patterns, like, for example, the names, kind of interesting, the root names. There are some similar themes, but with regards to, I mean, the first story was about the Romans during Constantine time coming to the Americas, while um, the Witnesses of Conduit said it was about the Israelites coming to America. So there are some, I mean, I'll admit to you that there's definitely a lot of differences. Um, but for example, like one of the points that some of the witnesses kept on bringing up was, and it came to pass is found very frequently in Solomon Spalding's manuscript found, which is found in the Book of Mormon, but and it came to pass is not found in the first manuscript. So take that for what it's worth.
In the mid 1880s, the president of Oberlin College, his name is James Fairchild, he acquires and is able to look at some early documents from this Ohio period that were in the possession of the newspaper editors there. And what they find is this long lost manuscript from Solomon Spalding, which people had for half a century said this is the origin of the Book of Mormon. They compare it, and what do they find? Not only is it not word for word the Book of Mormon, James Fairchild even says that there doesn't even seem to be a character or incident common between the two books. And even though all the detractors had said, oh yes, he wrote it like the Bible, that's why it kind of sounds like the Bible, James Fairchild says the solemn style and imitation of the King James Bible doesn't appear in this book. And then concludes the only rational conclusion that a president of a university has to come to, and that is some other explanation of the Book of Mormon must be had if one's needed at all. The reality is most historians don't look to this Solomon Spalding manuscript explanation of the text of the Book of Mormon anymore. And so it's interesting because that mid-19th century period for the Latter-day Saints is really when Latter-day Saints are the most hated. Between 1840 and 1890, that 50-year period is when Mormonism is a hiss and a byword to the United States. During that entire period, when Mormons are being discussed in the halls of Congress, they're dismissed constantly as, well, it's all just coming from that Solomon Spalding manuscript. And they're all wrong. In fact, the claims that were made over and over and over again by people like Philastus Hurlbut and Eber Howe and these other people, they're proven to be false, even though lots of people believe them.
That's very interesting. I did not know all of that. Thank you.
It was probably not as, maybe a little more detailed than you wanted, but
No, it's great.
I understand that, I believe these people are very sincere, and I really think that they are just honestly mistaken. They don't realize that there is evidence, as I give in my videos. But anyways, I thought that was interesting to point out there because I thought it was important to look at what do they have to say, and basically what was he saying? Well, basically he was claiming that there is just one manuscript, and yet what's really interesting to me is, so you have Solomon Spalding, he's writing the manuscript 1809, 1812, moves to Pittsburgh, works on it some more. Still, he wants to publish it, but when you do read manuscript story, it has an abrupt ending. There is some pages missing. It's not as polished as it should be. So, to me, this, it doesn't make sense that this was the manuscript. So, and like I gave you the testimony of Aaron Wright. I mean, he said, this is not the manuscript that I was referencing. I was referencing another manuscript, and unfortunately, that manuscript is missing. Manuscript found. And ironic. Manuscript found is manuscript missing. Well, it's sad, but that's just the truth of the matter. I mean, so anyways, you know, we're gonna watch this one now. So this is Mr. Callahan, Tad Callister. I'm sorry, Tad Callister. And this is a video that says facts of the Book of Mormon is true. Now, before I play this video, I want us to recognize that he has written a book on. I have not read it, but he is. I'm not expecting him to fully go into and critique every single objection. I mean, I know he's going to spend just a little time with each objection because he only has so much time. So, I'm not. I'm giving him some leeway here, but and I'm sure he wouldn't mind discussing this more if he wanted to. But I would say that probably what he's doing is he is putting forth his best main point when he wants to talk about these possible or the theories that where the Book of Mormon had come from. So let's have a listen to what he has to say, and I think that'll be very important.
I do believe that the Book of Mormon, combined with the Spirit, is the greatest witness we have of the truthfulness of this church. Accordingly, at some point, the critics must answer the question, how did the Book of Mormon come forth? Was it?
Yeah, and I agree with that. How did the Book of Mormon come forth? I would agree with him on that.
Man-made as claimed by them, or God-inspired as claimed by us? The initial argument of the critics in this respect was that Joseph Smith could not have written the Book of Mormon. It was just too comprehensive and complex for him. This was based on the premise.
Agree with that. And that's what we saw in the last video, right?
That Joseph was only 23 years of age at the time, that he was unlearned and uneducated and thus incapable of writing it. Therefore, someone far more intelligent and skilled than he must have done so. One of the proposed candidates was Sidney Rigdon. After all, he was a minister, a theologian, and an orator, certainly a likely prospect. In order to understand the supreme irony of this argument, however, one needs to remember that the Book of Mormon was published in March of 1830. The church was organized in April of 1830, and then in October of 1830, 6 months later, Parley P. Pratt preached the gospel for the first time to whom, of all people, Sidney Rigdon, his former minister, and bears testimony to him of the Book of Mormon. In other words, Sidney was converted by the very book he was supposed to have written. Nancy Rigdon Ellis, the daughter of Sidney, and age 7 at the time, was a witness of this event. She would later write, I saw them hand my father the book, meaning the Book of Mormon, and I am as positive as can be that he never saw it before. He read it and examined it for about an hour, and then threw it down and said he did not believe a word in it. Of course, he later did believe it and joined the church. This is but one of the multiple historical evidences we have that Sidney Rigdon never came in contact with the Book of Mormon until after it was published. Accordingly, this argument carries little weight today. Another candidate who...
Okay, so you can see there what his main arguments were, and I'm sure he would have elaborated more if he wanted to, right? So let me show you a slide that I think is very important to look at. And we're going to look at slide 1543. So what I think Mr. Callister has to do is he needs to explain then all this information here. I think he needs to help us to understand and elaborate more on that. And I cover this in another video, but let me also turn your attention to number 1500. So he says it carries a little weight, but my friend, I mean, you think about the witnesses of Solomon Spalding to manuscript found, witnesses from Solomon Spalding to Sidney Rigdon, witnesses from Sidney Rigdon's foreknowledge of the Book of Mormon, witnesses from Sidney Rigdon to Joseph Smith. And yes, there's not a substantial amount as we would like, but there is some. And then there's contradictions in the Book of Mormon, modern theological issues in the Book of Mormon, like universalism. There's witnesses of Joseph Smith's character that need to explain his, Joseph Smith. When you really study his character, I'm sorry, he was, he was not, so to speak, an angel. I mean, he was, I hate to say this, but he was someone who was sadly deceptive. Then you have first vision contradictions, and then you have, interesting enough, kind of an equal balance of Sidney Rigdon and Joseph Smith's relationship. So the best explanation for me for that is the Book of Mormon. For the Book of Mormon is that it did come from Solomon Spalding through Sidney Rigdon. Now, he mentioned Nancy Rigdon, the daughter. I understand that, but what's really interesting to me is, okay, so you have in, let's see here, 1888 in Salt Lake City Tribunal, if I remember right. Yeah. And you have Mr. Walter Sidney Rigdon, which was a grandson of Sidney Rigdon, and he claims, listen to what he says. Grandfather was a religious crank, says Mr. Rigdon, till he lost money by it. He started as a Baptist preacher, had a very fine congregation for those days in Pittsburgh. There was no reason at all for his leaving except that he got cracked, and at that time he had no ideas. Sorry, I just want to go down here, if that'd be all right. So we're going down. It says, he found Joe Smith, and they had a great many talks together before they brought out the plates. None of us ever doubted that they got the whole thing up. But Father always maintained that Grandfather helped get up the original Spalding book. At any rate, he got a copy very early and schemed on some way to make it useful. So you see, why is it that now there's a grandson who comes forward and says, this is the truth? So that's something to take into consideration there. And then slide 1464. Oh, sorry. 710. So, I mean, he says, well, there's just not much weight to this. But if you look at this, man, there's a lot of witness testimony considering the connection between Solomon Spalding and Sidney Rigdon. And then those who claim that Sidney Rigdon had stolen the manuscript of Solomon Spalding. And then you have those who said that he foreknew the Book of Mormon was coming out in that third column. And then you have some who did say that Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon had actually talked together before his alleged conversion in October and November 1830. So that's something for us to think about. So I hope you can see that we are responding to those who are the critics here. I really appreciate being with you today, and it's certainly been a blessing. And if you haven't watched my series, please, I urge you to watch it so that you can familiarize yourself with the material. I know it's a lot of material, but it's it's worth going through because I'm trying to honestly show where the Book of Mormon most likely came from. And I love people. I want them to come to knowledge of the truth. I care for their souls. I think they're being sincerely misled. And I hope that we can reach them with the true gospel of Jesus Christ. So I really appreciate being with you today, and it's certainly been a blessing. So have a good night.